We're going from Dr. Stallard's very devotional teaching about the glory of God to now the beast of Revelation. So I don't know quite how to transition into that, except to say that we've saved the beast for last. I was working on that all night, how to make this transition.
That covers my lawyer job.
Now, what I'm trying to do in these two sessions is do a critique of a book written by Kenneth Gentry entitled The Beast of Revelation. And you'll remember from my first session, we talked about how Gentry will date the book of Revelation in the 60s and claim that most of its prophecies were fulfilled just a few years later in the final years of Nero's reign. And he has come out with this whole book arguing that the prophecies regarding the beast have been fulfilled in the person of Nero. And so in the first session, just to recap, what we did is looked at some of his assumptions that he makes about the text. Rather than seeing the theme of the book of Revelation as the second coming of Christ, he sees it as the Jewish War of AD 66 to 70. Rather than viewing Revelation's so-called time text qualitatively, he views them chronologically. Near, shortly, quickly. Those types of words that appear in Revelation push him towards this idea that the prophecies contained therein were fulfilled in the person of Nero and in the events surrounding the fall of Jerusalem in AD 70. Rather than date the book late, he dates it early. Rather than viewing the general genre of Revelation as prophecy, he seems to approach it apocalyptically. He won't necessarily come out and say that, but that seems to be one of his operating assumptions, and that allows him to dispense with the literal, grammatical, historical method of interpretation. And now what we're ready to do, with his assumptions in mind, is approach the text of Revelation 13. And apparently this is a very important issue for him, or he wouldn't have written an entire book on this subject. And what he does is he relies upon 7 clues in the book of Revelation chapter 13 to argue that these clues, when taken as a whole, create this compelling case that the prophecies of the beast of Revelation were fulfilled in the person of Nero. He calls it a mosaic. In other words, you don't just look at one clue by itself. When you put them all together, in his mind, the rational person couldn't help but conclude that the prophecies of the book of Revelation were fulfilled in the person of Nero. And what I want to do in this session is just march through his clues and show you how uncompelling they are, and show you that the data of the text fits far better with a futurist understanding of the beast of Revelation than the preterist understanding of the beast of Revelation. And I think if we walk through this, we'll get a better feel for preterist hermeneutics, if you can apply that word hermeneutics to preterism. I don't know if we can do that. But these guys are going to be all over the map. And I think this will help us better interact with preterism when we see it, better explain it to our people that are in our ministries, and so forth. So here we go. Let's start with the first one. First clue he relies upon is what he calls the character of the beast. And here he'll rely on Revelation chapter 13, verses 1 and 2. And these verses say, "Then I stood on the sand of the sea, and I saw a beast rising up out of the sea, and on its head, having 7 heads and 10 horns, and on his horns 10 crowns, and on his heads a blasphemous name. Now the beast I saw was like that of a leopard. His feet were like that of a bear, and his mouth like that of a lion. The dragon gave him his authority, his power, his throne, and his authority. And the Greek word here for beast is the word therion. And so what Gentry does is he goes into some lexical tools, and he finds a few examples where therion can refer to a person's beastly character. And I would agree with him on that. And then at this point, he goes into his classical historians. This is very big in his book. And he assembles all of this historical data to demonstrate what a beastly person Nero was. You know, Nero raped people and maimed people and murdered and pillaged. And he assembles all of this stuff and says, there's clue number one. Revelation chapter 13 verses 1 and 2 talks about a beastly character, and Nero fits that criteria. And let me just say something about this. The typical line that's raised against our camp, and I think this line is inaccurate, but what they accuse us of over and over again in their writings is reading prophecies in the Bible, and then we rush to a 21st century newspaper to try to find fulfillments of prophecy. I'm sure we've all been accused of that from time to time. That's thrown at our camp constantly. And I would just want to turn that around and say, what is Gentry doing here? He's reading prophecies in the Bible, but then he rushes to newspapers, not 21st century newspapers, but first century newspapers to find fulfillments of prophecy. So the next time the term newspaper exegesis is hurled at you, that's something that we might want to keep in mind as we're dialoguing with preterists, because I don't see them doing anything different. And this clue in and of itself proves nothing. There have been several people in the history of the world that have had a beastly character. Adolf Hitler had a beastly character. I think the coming Antichrist will top Nero in terms of having a beastly character. And then Gentry says something, I think, where he begins to stumble. He starts arguing actually more for a futurist view inadvertently. And he notes that in verse 2, John compounds the various beasts of Daniel 7 into one composite person. And Gentry says that proves how beastly this beast is and how that is fulfilled in the person of Nero. And then Gentry does something very strange. He starts correlating the fourth beast of Daniel with the beast of Revelation. Starts connecting them. So he makes this statement. He says John's beast even has 10 horns like Daniel's fourth beast. And he's right. There is a connection between the fourth beast of Daniel and the beast of Revelation. Both have a worldwide empire. Both rule for 3.5 years. Both dominate the saints for 3.5 years. Both are characterized by their arrogant and their blasphemous words. But the moment he starts going down this path is the moment he's actually arguing for our interpretation, futurism. And I think he does this inadvertently, because when you start examining the details of Daniel's fourth beast, it becomes obvious that these details haven't been fulfilled in any time in history. They await a future fulfillment. Daniel's fourth beast will crush the entire earth, not just the known world of the time. Daniel's fourth beast will come to power through a 10-king confederacy. Daniel's fourth beast will experience instantaneous destruction. Daniel's fourth beast, after experiencing instantaneous destruction, will be immediately replaced by an eternal political kingdom. That comes from a plain reading of Daniel 7. And surely these events have never happened. It's almost humorous to watch commentators try to shove these particular events in the past, but the details of the text never nicely line up. And so the point I'm trying to make here in this initial clue is that Gentry, he's arguing now for the character of the beast, but he actually stumbles, in my opinion, by connecting the fourth beast of Daniel with the beast of Revelation. And the fourth beast of Daniel favors a futurist interpretation rather than a preterist interpretation. All right, let's move on to the next clue that he relies upon. And this clue is the death of the beast. And notice, if you will, here he's relying upon Revelation chapter 13 and verse 10. says, "He who leads into captivity he shall go. He who kills with the sword must be killed." Here is the patience and the faith of the saints. Now, Gentry, all the way through this book, the beast of Revelation, is saying, look, this beast can't be someone 2,000 years removed into the future. He's got to be someone relevant to John's original audience. Who was John's original audience? The 7 churches of Asia Minor. And so what he argues from Revelation chapter 3 and verse 10 is that this particular text was written as a word of encouragement to the persecuted churches of Asia Minor during the Neronian persecution. And actually what he's saying is these are words of encouragement because the Holy Spirit, according to Gentry, is telling these churches that the beast who is killing you will be killed. The beast who is oppressing you will be oppressed. The beast who is slaying you will be slain himself. And so he's arguing a word of encouragement to the 7 churches of Asia Minor. And he said this particular verse was perfectly, in his mind, fulfilled in the person of Nero. Why? Because according to Gentry, Nero wielded the sword against the churches of Asia Minor during the Neronian persecution. And then Nero died by the sword. Because Nero, according to history, took a dagger as he was assisted by his secretary Epaphroditus and rammed it into his own throat. And Gentry says, there we have it, we have a fulfillment of prophecy. Now, there are numerous problems with this. For example, where is suicide mentioned here in verse 10? See, the idea, and Simon Kistemacher brings this out in his commentary, the idea here is the beast's death, and the natural interpretation of these verses is the beast's death is caused by an external source from the outside. That doesn't fit Nero very well because Nero inflicted his own wound and killed himself through suicide. Also, key point here, is many commentators, including Leon Morris and Robert Mounts, have concluded or have gone through the evidence and the historical evidence and concluded that the Neronic persecution was confined to Rome. It was a local persecution and actually never traveled into Asia Minor. So the question we would ask him is, how can Revelation chapter 13 and verse 10 be a word of encouragement to the persecuted churches of Asia Minor when, historically speaking, the Neronian persecution never reached the churches of Asia Minor? And this is the type of thing you run into in his writings. There are all kinds of these geographical disconnects. Another problem, and this will be good for a pre-trib audience, is there's a phrase that's used over and over again in the 7 letters to the 7 churches. And we all know what that phrase is. If anyone has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. That's used 7 times in Revelation chapter 2 and 3. Well, here we find almost the identical phrase. If anyone has, in verse 9, if anyone has an ear, let him hear. But the phrase, what the Spirit says to the churches, is omitted. And this has led many people, Robert Thomas, John Walvoord, right on down the list, to conclude that a different group is in view here in Revelation chapter 13, verses 9 and 10, than the church, or particularly the 7 churches of Asia Minor. And of course this fits right in line with our pre-trib theology, because as futurists, as dispensationalists, we believe that these words are actually a word of encouragement to the tribulation saints in the midst of the tribulation period, after the church has already been translated or removed from the earth. That's why you don't find the word church or ecclesia used from chapter 4 all the way through the end of chapter 19. I don't even think the word comes up until the end of 19 or maybe into 20, 21, and 22. That whole period describing the tribulation period, the church is missing. the missing church. But the word ecclesia occurs, I think, 19 times or so in the first 3 chapters. So the point I'm trying to make here is it's almost impossible to argue that Revelation chapter 13 and verses 9 and 10 is a word of encouragement to the persecuted churches of Asia Minor, when many commentators conclude that a totally different group other than the churches of Asia Minor is brought out here in verses 9 and 10. See, these are little things to bring up when we run into this line of argument. Well, let's keep going here. Why don't you jump down to verse 14. The next clue he relies upon has to do with the revival of the beast, the revivification of the beast. See, these passages not only do they depict the beast's death, but they depict his resurrection. Maybe it's a pseudo-resurrection of some kind. I'm not completely sure on that. But notice the very end of verse 14. It says, "To the beast who was wounded by the sword and yet lived." Now, how in the world does he explain that? Did Nero resurrect from the dead? No, he didn't. And here we're going back now to his first century historians, first century newspapers. We go back now to Josephus, and he amasses all of this data on how after the suicide of Nero, I think it was June 9th, AD 68, the Roman Empire was hurled into civil war. And there were 3 minor emperors, Galba, Otho, and Vitellius, that reigned for a short time. Each of those emperors were either violently usurped from their throne or they were murdered themselves. And according to Josephus, the empire was in this tumultuous state during this 1-year period. And then an emperor by the name of Vespasian, I think about AD 69, came to the throne. And Josephus talks about how order was restored in the empire. And Gentry says, there we have it. We have a revival of the beast, not in the person of Nero, but in the person of the Roman Empire. The non-person, I should say, of the Roman Empire. And he has this whole discussion about image shifting. How in Revelation 13 there's a constant shift in imagery between the beast as the ruler and the kingdom that he presides over. And I would have to agree there is some degree of image shifting in this chapter. Daniel 2 and 7. You'll find that type of image shifting. But the problem I have with the way Gentry is interpreting this particular passage is every time the beast's death is spoken of, it's always spoken of, every time the beast's resurrection is spoken of, it's always spoken of in the context of his death. For example, in Revelation 13 and verse 3, Revelation 13 and verse 14, chapter 17 verse 8, chapter 17 and verse 11, you get that idea. And I would argue that a straightforward reading of this text would lead someone to the conclusion that the same beast who is killed will be the same beast who is resurrected. But Gentry here rejects this straightforward interpretation, and he instead opts for this view which says the beast's death was personal and individual in the person of Nero, but the beast's revival was non-personal and national in the entity of the Roman Empire. But the more significant problem he has is look at the very end of verse 3. It says, "And all the world marveled and followed the beast." In other words, after the beast's resurrection, there would be a global following after, or a global amazement of the beast. And you can try the ram, jam, cram hermeneutic all you want, but it's very difficult to fit that language back into AD 70. And Gentry will say, well, wait a minute, the word world here is the word earth or land, which in some contexts refers to the local land of Israel. But in my previous session, I showed that that same word can have a global nuance in other contexts. John in Revelation 21:1 says, "Behold, I saw a new heavens and a new what? a new earth. They're the same Greek word is used. That word there is obviously used in a global nuance. Which interpretation do we supply? The local understanding or the global understanding? Context tells us. And the context here is global because of the adjective whole or ole in the Greek before the word land. Whole land. All the earth. And that language doesn't naturally fit well with the local events of AD 70. All right, let's move on to the next clue that he relies upon. And unfortunately, I've forgotten to flipping my slides. The next clue he relies upon is the part of Revelation 13, which talks about the worship of the beast. So we've got the beast's character, we've got the beast's death, we've got the beast's revival or resurrection, and Gentry at this point is arguing that the snowball is rolling and the evidence is amassing, and rational people are more and more getting on board with his line of thinking. That's how his book reads. Look at verse 8. It says, "All who dwell on the earth will worship Him, whose names have not been found written in the book of life of the Lamb, slain from the foundation of the world." And here he's relying upon this verse and other verses which talk about the worship that the beast receives. And now we go back to the first century historians. And he says, Caesar worship was a reality in the first century world. He has examples of Nero being deified on a coin. And he says, you see, Nero was worshipped just as this particular text indicates. Well, what problem does he have? Well, he's got the same problem of the global language that he had at the previous point. Look at this language here in verse 8. All who dwell on the earth will worship Him. He'll say, wait a minute, that word earth there can have a local nuance, which is true in some cases, but in other contexts it has a global nuance. The context here is global. Look at the word all that comes beforehand. Look at the previous clause. And authority, the end of verse 7, was given to Him over every, notice that word every, tribe, people, tongue, and nation. Now, if that isn't global language, I don't know what is. It's almost impossible to take language of this magnitude and ram, jam, and cram it. I'm using that term from Charlie Clough. Back into the local events of AD 70. Now, Gentry is what we call a partial preterist. He still holds to a future parousia, or coming of Christ. He still holds to a future resurrection. He still holds to a future judgment. And so it's interesting in his writings, he wants to put all this stuff in the past, but then he gets over to Revelation 20 and he'll say, oh, this is futuristic over here. If he doesn't do that, he starts violating the creeds of the faith. And he's immediately labeled as a heretic. So he's got to save a few shreds for the end. But I find it quite interesting that this particular phrase here in verse 8, whose names have not been written in the book of life of the Lamb. That same phrase is used in Revelation 20 with respect to the futuristic judgment, a judgment that Gentry acknowledges as future. The same phrase that's used here is used in Revelation 20 regarding something Gentry would believe is a futuristic judgment. So the question I would have is, why does the same phrase have a universal futuristic meaning over here in chapter 20, but that identical phrase has a local historical meaning back here in chapter 13? I guess you could do that if there's something in this text which clearly signals a local purview. But there's nothing in the text which signals that. And this is one of the problems with partial preterism, is it creates all of these unnatural bifurcations in the book of Revelation and all of these unnatural inconsistencies that need not be there. But his theology drives him to the point where these inconsistencies begin to exist. Now, while we're on the subject of the worship of the beast, why don't we flip over to Revelation chapter 13 and verse 15. says he was granted power to give breath to the image of the beast, that the image of the beast should both speak and causes many who would not worship the image of the beast to be killed. Now, how in the world do you explain that? How in the world do you fit that back into the Neronic reign? Well, he has an answer for that. Tries to answer it anyway. What he's arguing here is that this passage was fulfilled in AD 66, when the king of Armenia, named Tiridates, came and prostrated himself before Nero. And then Tiridates turned to these images that were set up on a platform and began to pay homage to these particular images. And Gentry says, you see, the image of the beast, the prophecies regarding the image of the beast were fulfilled now in AD 66. Let's just think about that for a minute. This image that's mentioned here is a singular noun, right? The images that Gentry is talking about are plural. The image that's mentioned here is a miraculous image which begins to receive breath and begins to speak. And he can look through his historical sources all he wants. This particular one he's using Dio Cassius. He can look through him all he wants, but the images that Dio Cassius talks about didn't miraculously speak. Now, John Walvoord's comments here are very important, because Walvoord will connect this verse here in verse 15 with the future desecration of the temple by the Antichrist. Walvoord believes, and I would agree with him on this, that what the Antichrist will do in the future temple is analogous to what Antiochus did in the temple in the intertestamental period. Because the same word in Daniel, abomination of desolation, that's used to prophesy Antiochus' activities in the temple, is the same set of words or same concept that's used in Daniel 9:27 regarding the future activities of the Antichrist. And Walvoord believes that the future Antichrist will go into the temple, he will put an end to the Jewish sacrifices, and he will set up a pagan image in the temple, just as Antiochus did in the intertestamental period. And Walvoord believes that the image that the Antichrist will set up in the temple is the very one that's mentioned here in verse 15. An interpretation I concur with. But if Walvoord is correct, there's no way this particular verse can be fulfilled in the AD 66 activities of Tiridates, because Tiridates never worshipped a singular image set up in the Jewish temple that breathed and miraculously began to speak. See, to make this passage fit AD 66, you have to completely ignore the specifics of the passage. But supposedly in academia, we're dealing now with a new genre in which the details of the passage can be discarded. And as long as the passage essentially fulfills what's prophesied, that's okay. That's a line of thinking that we as dispensationalists reject. This passage will be fulfilled specifically, precisely, and exactly. Let's move now to the next clue that Gentry relies upon. And this clue pertains to the 42-month war of the saints, on the saints by the beast. And here he's relying upon Revelation chapter 13 and verse 5 and Revelation chapter 13 and verse 7. Verse 5 says, "And he was given a mouth speaking great things and blasphemies, and he was given authority to continue for 42 months. Verse 7, "It was granted to him to make war with the saints and to overcome them. And authority was given to him over every tribe, tongue, people, and nation." And so now Gentry, to argue that this passage is fulfilled in the person and life of Nero, goes back to his first century historians And he begins now to document the Neronian persecution and how long it lasted. And he says, look, the Neronian persecution began, mid to late November of AD 64. And it ended with the death of Nero, June 9th, AD 68. And Gentry says, there we have it. Roughly, notice that term roughly a 42-month period. And thus, Nero's activity fulfilled Revelation chapter 13 and verse 5 regarding this 42-month period. Now here's a very interesting point to make about preterism and Gentry's interpretation. You see what he's just done. You remember Franklin Delano Roosevelt said, don't change horses in midstream? In other words, when I was a basketball player and we would travel to the Philippines to play basketball, one minute you look at the scoreboard and you're up by 10 points. The next minute you're down by 10 points. So what happened? Well, someone's cheating. Someone is changing the score. Someone is changing the rules in the middle of an athletic contest. Well, that's exactly what he's done here. Suddenly now he's shifted to this great literalist. Suddenly he's taking this 42-month period literally. And I think that's quite strange because back in verse 15 he didn't take that literally. And the way he's taking this number, 42 months, is inconsistent with respect to how he approaches other numbers in the book of Revelation. How does he approach, for example, the number 12,000? Revelation 7 has two numbers, 12,000 and 144,000. How does he approach those? Well, here he says in his commentary, inarguably, and I don't know about you, whenever someone starts a sentence with inarguably, I get a little bit nervous. Inarguably, an elevated symbolism is here presented. If nothing else, the perfect rounding of numbers, along with the exact identical count in each of the 12 tribes, bespeak a symbolic representation. So 12,000 and 144,000 are non-literal. Well, how does that raised my curiosity a little bit. And so I looked at how he interpreted Revelation chapter 20. The number 1,000 appears 6 times in Revelation 20. Well, how does he treat that? Well, here he says, as I pointed out above in my treatment of the 144,000, the number 1,000 is surely, notice that word surely a symbolic sum representing a quantitative perfection. So some numbers he treats quite literally, other numbers he treats non-literally. And so the question that I wanted to that was raised in my mind is, why is 42 months literal, but these other numbers are non-literal? And the closest thing I could come to an explanation in his writings is the following statement. He says, surely, there's the word surely again, surely the large rounded numbers of Revelation, like 1,000, 144,000, 200 million, should be understood as symbols. But it is not at all clear that the smaller numbers or shorter time frames must be so understood. Translation. If the number is large and rounded, it's a symbol. If the number is shorter and unrounded, suddenly the number becomes literal. Now, isn't it interesting that all of these rules people come up with for interpreting the book of Revelation will never work in the real world? Let's say you're the beneficiary in a will, and the probate court says to you, well, the large rounded numbers will treat in an allegorical fashion, but the smaller numbers that are unrounded we're going to interpret literally. It's just fascinating, and I was playing basketball with a particular gentleman that holds to these types of views, and I said to him, now, are we going to keep literal score here, or is the score just kind of allegorical? Game was to 11, and I wanted to know exactly what I was, how many points we're supposed to score. But the point I'm trying to make is these academics come up with these bizarre hermeneutical rules which would never work in the real world. And so this is something that you see in preterism, particularly in Gentry's writings. There's this constant fluctuation back and forth between allegorical interpretation and literal interpretation, depending upon what fits his need at any given time. He takes the 7 kings in Revelation 17 literally because he needs that to date the book. He takes the number 42 literally because he thinks he can fit that into the Neronian reign. But suddenly 1,000, 12,000, and 144,000, numbers that don't fit his preconceived system, all of a sudden those numbers are given a completely different interpretation. And even if you overlook all of those inconsistencies, the Neronian persecution never lasted 42 months. Exactly. Gentry admits this. He says, but for a few days. This represents a 42-month period. And then J. Stuart Russell, who's a full preterist, commenting on this passage, says, that is as nearly as possible to 3.5 years. So they use this language, but for a few days, and as nearly as possible. And what they're admitting when they use that type of language is they can't get the Neronian persecution to fit exactly with 42 months. And as a futurist, I believe, and so do you, that when this passage is fulfilled, it's going to be fulfilled exactly. Now, why would I say that? Because this passage is talking about the 70th week of Daniel. The first 69 weeks of that particular prophecy were fulfilled to the exact day. Dr. Honer has written extensively on this subject. This is a long-standing dispensational view. Alva J. McLean, Sir Robert Anderson. And so when this passage is fulfilled, it's not going to be but for a few days, or that is as nearly as possible. It's going to be fulfilled exactly. Now, Gentry, regarding this issue of the war of the beast, has another problem. Because look at verse 7. Look at the last phrase there. And authority was given to him over every, notice that word every, tribe, tongue, people, and nation. Now those 4 Greek words, tribe, people, tongue, and nation, are used in Revelation chapter 5, verse 9. The order of the words is a little bit different, but the same words are used. And in Revelation chapter 5, verse 9, those words are used to describe the universal benefits of Christ's death. The fact that Christ would have disciples or followers or people who are saved in every nation. Universal language is used there. And if those 4 words connote universality over in Revelation chapter 5, verse 9, certainly those same words are describing the universal influence of the beast in the tribulation period. This is not going to fit AD 70. What this is talking about is a future new world order that the Antichrist will preside over. I would argue a new world order that we see coming together before our very eyes. It's just interesting, the last term of the Supreme Court, the justices who are supposedly the guardians of our Constitution demonstrated in their opinions that they're far more interested in international treaties and international law and European law than they are in our own Constitution. See, globalism is not something that's coming. Globalism is something that's happening. It's here right now, and the stage is being set for the future reign of the Antichrist after the rapture of the church. Let's move now to the next clue that Gentry is relying upon. And this is the number of the beast. Now, this is his grand slam. This is his knockout punch. He feels everybody will follow his interpretation on this one. Now notice the verse he's using, a very familiar verse. Revelation chapter 13 and verse 18. He says, here's wisdom. Let him who has understanding calculate the number of the beast. For it is the number of man. His number is 666. Now, here Gentry is relying upon something called gematria. I'll explain that in just a second. To argue that the number 666 totals up to the name of Caesar Nero. He's using gematria. Now, in the ancient world, languages had a twofold purpose. The letters of the language had a phonetic significance in terms of pronunciation. Each of these letters also had a corresponding numerical equivalent. And that was true with Greek and Hebrew, as the following chart shows. Each Greek letter and each Hebrew letter had a corresponding numerical equivalent. And so a person's name could be converted into a numerical equivalent simply by adding up all of the mathematical values of all of the letters of a person's name. A little bit of background there. And Gentry believes that John was employing this practice here in Revelation chapter 13 and verse 18. And maybe he was. I kind of lean towards the position that maybe John was doing this very thing. Now watch what Gentry does. You got to watch him very carefully. He's the kind of guy, where you shake his hand, and then 5 minutes later you realize you're missing a couple fingers. I mean, this guy is smooth. So what he does is he takes the Greek title for Nero, Caesar Nero, and then he will shift it now into Hebrew. We call it transliteration. He transliterates that now into Hebrew, and he comes up with the following word, the following Hebrew name for Caesar Nero, which supposedly in the Hebrew is Neron Kaiser. And then he goes back to Gematria, Hebrew Gematria, grabs the proper numerical equivalents for each of those Hebrew letters, adds them up, and guess what the total is? 666. And this is his knockout punch. These numbers total up to Nero's name. Now, what problems would we have with this? Well, we've got the same problem with the 42 months. Why is 1,000, 12,000, and 144,000 allegorical, but suddenly the number 666 is so literal that we can figure out a person's name from it? You see the hermeneutical vacillation that's going on here? You gravitate back and forth between a literal and allegorical method depending on what fits your need. Here 666 is quite literal because he feels he can use it to identify Nero. And this is one of the reasons I have always been attracted to dispensational theology, because dispensational theology is the only theological system I know of that avoids this type of nonsense and attempts to approach the text consistently. And that's what I love what's on the Tyndale website. Consistent literal hermeneutics. Not just literal hermeneutics selectively, but we try to consistently employ that from Genesis to Revelation. It's the only system of theology and interpretation that I'm even aware of that makes that attempt. And that shifts the authority away from me, the interpreter, back to the text where it belongs. Because if I've got the authority to, allegorize the text and make it what I want it to say, I can come up with all kinds of weird stuff. I've tried for years to find Bill Clinton's name in here somewhere, and it just hasn't worked out. But what he's doing, the second problem he's doing here is he's shifting now from Greek to Hebrew. Why is he doing that? I'll tell you very simply, Greek's not going to work. You know what Greek adds up to? It adds up to 1,005. So that won't work, so let's go over to Hebrew. Let's try that out. And the shift from Greek into Hebrew is one of the things that's very strange here, because John, when he wrote the book of Revelation, was writing to the 7 churches of Asia Minor, which was primarily a Greek-speaking audience. Now, there were Jewish factions within that, but primarily the audience was Greek-speaking. There is nothing in the context here in Revelation chapter 13 and verse 18 to lead the interpreter to the conclusion that you have to transliterate to Hebrew to make this work. Now at this point, let me just tell you what he says. He'll say, look, Hebrew words and concepts are employed frequently in the book of Revelation. Like in Revelation 9 and verse 11, we find the Hebrew word Abaddon. And in Revelation chapter 16 and verse 16, we find the Hebrew word Armageddon. But here's something interesting about that. When John wants to tell us a Hebrew concept or a Hebrew word is being employed, you know what John does? He makes that clear. He alerts us ahead of time. So, in Revelation 16:16, it says they gathered them together to a place in the Hebrew called Armageddon. John has told us that we're having a shift now. In Revelation chapter 9 and verse 11, it says in the bottomless pit, all that stuff, whose name in the Hebrew is Abaddon. Now, when we look at Revelation chapter 13 and verse 18, the same formula is not applied. There is nothing in the context to tell the reader that to search this riddle out using Hebrew instead of Greek. These letters are in Greek, and so the shift to Hebrew is unlikely. Not only that, but it appears that Gentry, and Greg Beale brings this out in his commentary, has arbitrarily selected a particular version of Nero's name to get it to fit his predetermined result. Nero's name was not his original name. Nero was his adopted name. Not only that, but Nero had other titles besides Caesar. I don't even know why he's got to put the title in here, other than the fact that he's got to get this to work out correctly mathematically. Not only that, but most of the archaeological evidence demonstrates that the word Caesar here in Hebrew is misspelled. Most of the archaeological evidence would add an additional letter after the first letter, which is a yod, which would damage the Neronic calculation. Not only that, but none of the ancient commentators suggested Caesar Nero as a solution to 666. Not even Irenaeus. Remember who Irenaeus was? Irenaeus is directly connected to John through the person of Polycarp. Irenaeus is one generation removed from John. If anybody would know what 666 meant, it would be Irenaeus. And Irenaeus, in one of his works, even begins to suggest various possibilities for who 666 is. And he never once says you got to find the solution in Hebrew, and never once suggests Nero. He gives other options, but not Nero. Not only that, but here's a very interesting point. This solution, that 666 equals Nero, never even came about until some German scholars stumbled upon this in the 1800s. Prior to German liberals, by the way. So the view did not breathe anywhere in church history until the 1800s. Now, isn't that interesting? Isn't this the same crowd that accuses us of making up the pre-trib rapture doctrine in the 1800s? And as we saw from Tommy's presentation last night, we're finding more and more historical evidence that that's not true. Not only that, Paul believed in the pre-trib rapture. It's in the Bible. But yet they will turn around now and come up with this Neronic calculation, which didn't breathe in the church until the 1800s. And so I would find that to be a little bit of a double standard. Not only that, but we should never use gematria to find people in church history as the Antichrist. If you have enough free time and enough creativity, you can make these numbers sound any way you want. For example, if A equals 100, B equals 101, C equals 102, and so forth, the name Hitler totals up to 666. It's not difficult to find possible solutions. And every time gematria has been used to find people in church history as the Antichrist, the results have always been inaccurate. So Alan Johnson says the sheer disagreement and confusion created through the years by the gematria method should have long ago warned the church that it was on the wrong track. Now, why is that true? Why is it that we can never use gematria to find people in church history as the Antichrist? It's very simple. In this dispensation, in this age that we're living in, the Antichrist, the lawless one, is being restrained. He's being held back. 2 Thessalonians 2 tells us, so to try to identify him using some sort of mathematical contraption will never produce profitable results, because Scripture tells us that that man is not going to be revealed in our dispensation. It's not until after the rapture of the church, until after the tribulation period begins, that 666 will even begin to make sense to anybody. Because that's the generation that will need the information, not us in the church age. Well, let's wrap up here with the final clue that Gentry and others relies upon to identify the beast of Revelation as Nero. The last clue that they rely upon, and here Gentry is not so much doing this. He doesn't mention this particular point in his book, but some of his colleagues do this. They look now to the relationship between the first beast and the second beast. Beginning in Revelation chapter 13 and verse 11, we now see a second beast arising. We know what they do with the first beast, that's Nero. What in the world do they do with the second beast? Well, it's interesting that many of them view this second beast as some sort of religious institution. The first beast is Nero, but the second beast, according to Gary DeMar, is a religion of Judaism that began persecuting the early church in the book of Acts. According to J. Adams, by the way, I don't know if people knew that J. Adams was a preterist. I like J. Adams and the work he's done with competence to counsel, but I wouldn't trust his eschatology too much. J. Adams identifies the second beast as a religious institution of the imperial cult or the imperial religious system which promoted Caesar worship. And so people that hold to this will point out the language in verse 11, like a lamb and spoke like a dragon. They'll say, aha, that's religious language, going back to what Christ said about false prophets in the Sermon on the Mount. And they'll point out that the second beast later on in the book is even labeled as a false prophet. And they'll say that's religious imagery. And they'll look, for example, at verse 12, which says, and he exercises all authority of the beast in his presence. And so they'll say this second beast, this religious system, supports the first beast by commanding the peoples of the ancient world to worship the first beast or to worship Nero. Well, what about these miracles? There's some miracles that are described in verses 13 and 15. How are those explained? Miracles performed by the second beast. How in the world are those explained? It's interesting how many of them will say, well, that's just ventriloquism, chicanery, hokum. And they'll go to all sorts of classical ancient historians which seem to, in some cases, support the idea that there was this kind of gimmickry and ventriloquism that took place in the ancient world empire. Well, how do they explain the mark of the beast? Verse 16, he causes all, both small and great, rich and poor, free and slave, to receive a mark on the right hand or their forehead. There's all kinds of attempts to try to tie this in with historical events in the past. One popular example is a certificate a person received verifying that he had burned incense in the name of Caesar. And the certificate was needed to buy and sell, and the certificate was needed to preserve a person from death. And they'll try to find some kind of analogous example of what's described here. Well, real quickly, what are some problems with this? Identifying the second beast as a religious institution. First of all, look at verse 16. He commands all, both small and great, rich and poor, free and slave. If that's not global universal language, I don't know what is. You cannot fit that back into some local scenario. Robert Thomas says this represents every civic, class, and cultural rank. All of humanity is in view here. This is global, it's universal, it's impossible to push this back into the past. It's something that's coming. It's also interesting to note that the second beast spends eternity in the lake of fire. Can a religious system spend eternity in the lake of fire? If a person spends eternity in the lake of fire, or if an entity spends eternity in the lake of fire, it communicates the idea that such an entity has a soul. And that is far more fitting of a description of people rather than a religious institution. Also, if the first beast is a specific individual, remember they're saying the first beast is Nero. If the first beast is a specific individual, then consistency seems to dictate that the second beast will be a specific individual. But here we go with the hermeneutical vacillation. The first beast is a specific individual, but the second beast is a non-personal religious system. Now that's quite odd, because the same Greek word, therion, is used to describe both beasts. Can we have a little consistency here? Also, the same personal pronoun autou is used to describe both beasts. So it's odd to take one beast as personal and individual, and the second verse as some kind of religious, non-personal religious system. Also, it's almost impossible to argue that the miracles spoken of in verses 13 through 15 are just ventriloquism and chicanery and tricks. Why? Because there's two Greek words that are used here. Look at verse 13. He performs, the Greek word poieo, verb. He performs great signs, the Greek word simeon. Now, you know where else those two words are employed by this same author? In his other book. Remember, John wrote 5 New Testament books. These same combination of words are consistently employed in combination to refer to the miracles of Jesus Christ. Were the miracles of Jesus Christ real and legitimate and genuine? Of course they were. That's the whole argument of John's Gospel. The whole argument of the book revolves around these 7 signs that Jesus performed. John records them to convince the world that Jesus is the Son of God. Now, if John, in writing another book, takes that same combination of Greek words and employs it here, what he's saying is that this second beast is performing real, legitimate miracles under the power of Satan. And then finally, all attempts to find a historical fulfillment of the passages regarding the mark of the beast ultimately fail, because no matter what historical scenario Gary DeMar or anybody else can come up with, their historical scenario never fits the details of the text. The text is quite specific. People receive a mark, which is apparently some kind of tattoo, upon, notice how specific the text is, the right hand or the forehead. Receiving a certificate, receiving some kind of stamp on a document, Jewish phylacteries, whatever we're going to come up with to find some historical fulfillment of the mark of the beast, never satisfy the details of the text. When prophecy is fulfilled, it will be fulfilled with exactness and precision. So these are the reasons that we should reject their interpretation of the second beast. So what have I tried to do in these 2 sessions? I've tried to give us a little bit of feel for preterism by looking at Gentry's book, The Beast of Revelation. And in my first session, we talked about the various assumptions that Gentry makes about the book of Revelation. We went through each of these assumptions, and we showed that each of these assumptions is invalid, it's inadequate. And then in my second session, we marched through the various clues that Gentry relies upon to argue that the prophecies of the beast of Revelation were fulfilled in the person of Nero. And we saw that these clues really don't fit the scenario he's trying to create. So the next time when you hear about this subject, the next time you hear someone on the radio advocating this type of thing, hopefully you'll have a little bit of ammunition and a little bit of fortification so you can analyze it a little better, understand it a little better, and explain it a little bit better to those that are in your ministry. And that's it.